Hi, thanks. So I was really excited to see that this was happening here. I've been dabbling a little bit in information visualization, and so I'm just happy to be able to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing. So the context that we started with was actually a project with the DST group, where they were interested in disaster management scenarios where there is a lot of communication that's happening. And one of the particular issues that they were concerned about was information flow during response to some disaster situation. And in particular, they were worried about things like are multiple organizations trying to organize water simultaneously and maybe conflicting with each other in that activity. And so they wanted to really understand essentially who was talking to who, what they were talking about, and what was the communication patterns that were happening. And were the people who were trying to coordinate the responses actually able to effectively understand and get a big picture view? So that was the context that we started with, and we realized that the kinds of communications that we have access to look something like this, right? A message with an identifier and some kind of content, and trying to go from this to having that kind of overview of what's happening in any kind of dynamic situation is really not non-trivial and not obvious how to do that. We had a little bit more information than that. We actually had timestamps and other kinds of context, email addresses, and so on. But the basic data is just very difficult to get a big overview on. Now, the standard way that this kind of network or communication data might be visualized is in the social network kind of model, where you have nodes corresponding to individuals and links between them if they're sending communications to each other. So the focus here is really on the individuals, and a lot of social network analysis kind of use this as a starting point. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at this and I really can't see anything in this. I think this is the typical kind of hairball, a kind of visualization that actually makes it very difficult to observe any meaningful kinds of patterns. Now, even using the force-directed layout that tends to be standardly used, you can get a sense of some of the structure of the network, so kind of who the key players are, because they might be pushed along the sides. But really, there's very little other than that you can observe from this. And it only focuses on part of the story, I would argue. It focuses on who is talking to whom, but not the other aspects of the communication. So another way to think about this is to look at the content of the communications themselves. And there has been some work on something called topic maps, in which essentially messages or communications are clustered in terms of their content. And so here are a couple examples of different kinds of visualizations which focus on the relationships between topics, and essentially doing clustering of content and then looking at co-occurrences or relationships between different kinds of content on the basis of the actual words or the themes that are expressed in the messages or in these are mostly articles actually. Another way to do it is to bring kind of two dimensions into it again. So having topics over time. So this is a tool that tries to map and visualize the changes in themes in a large document collection or a large message communication data set over time. And that does give you a sense of the topics and the themes that are coming across. But again, the emphasis here is on kind of two dimensions at most of the data that we're dealing with. So this is really, these kinds of visualizations focus on what people are talking about, and in the case of the second one, when they're talking about those things. So, but we actually have four dimensions in this data. We have the people who are sending the messages, as well as this kind of topic and temporal information. And so the challenge that we really faced was how to take all of those four key dimensions of the message structure for a relatively large data set, and try to visualize that in a way that would allow somebody to get a quick overview of patterns. And really the paradigm that we were working in was in the kind of visual analytics paradigm of thinking about visual queries. What kinds of questions would the people who were involved in these communications need to ask of the data? And the framework for the paradigm that, or the question that we thought was relevant in this particular context basically boils down to 4 dimensions: who is talking to whom, about what, and when. And that reflects the kind of 4 attributes of the communications that we have. We have senders, we have recipients, we have a message content, and we have a time at which the message was sent. And so our challenge was to kind of move away from these 2 attributes at a time kinds of visualizations to one that could capture all 4 of these dimensions. So because I work in the biological space, I had heard a talk by Martin Kruszwinski. Actually, he came and visited Melbourne a number of years ago, where he presented this idea of hive plots. And hive plots have been generally applied to biological networks. And the idea behind them is, there's a couple of key points. But of course, like any kind of network visualization, it primarily involves nodes and links. But the key thing that's going on in a hive plot is to restrict the nodes in the visualization to fall along particular axes. So every node in the representation, rather than just being spread around like in a force-directed layout, is constrained to be on some axis. And then the links between them, of course, are the edges, or the links between nodes along the axes. So everything falls along these axes. Now, there are lots of choices you can make in how you kind of adapt hive plots to any particular data set. You can decide which axis, what axis represents, and which axis a node should be assigned to. You can make different choices about where along the axes particular nodes occur. And of course, you can layer in all the kind of typical things we would expect in a visualization by playing with color and shape to represent different kinds of information. And generally, the idea is that the axes correspond to some characteristic of the data. Now, in the standard hive plot kind of usage in the molecular biology space, the axes tend to correspond to structural characteristics of the network. So this is something I took from Martin's work, where they're playing with those different aspects, the node position on the axis and the node assignment to particular axes, in order to look at relationships between network structures. So they're using metrics from social network analysis, clustering coefficients, next neighbor clustering coefficient, degree, number of next neighbors, and PageRank kind of metrics to assign particular nodes to particular axes. Now, this is great, and it really, I think, has a much cleaner kind of approach to visualizing the networks, and it allows you to really look at relationships that connect different kind of structural components. But there wasn't an obvious way to kind of deploy this to the semantic data that we were interested in modeling. But I felt like the paradigm had a lot of power. And so what we came up with was what I call semantic hive plots, which basically takes the same paradigm of hive plots, but adapts it to the context of our social communication data, again with keeping in mind that question of who did what to whom, who said what to whom about what and when. And what we came up with, focusing on a public data set called the Enron data set, the Enron corpus, which was all of the email that was released during the court proceedings during which Enron was being investigated for fraudulent activity. It's a fabulous resource for anybody who's interested in communication networks. There aren't too many email data sets that are widely available. So this is a really nice one that we used to kind of test the idea. But what we came up with was organizing the messages into topics by applying our thematic analysis. We use something called topic modeling, and then organizing people in terms of the topics of the messages that we sent. So what we have over along one axis, oops, where did my thing go? Oh, it's not working. Anyway, along one axis, we have topics. So we have segments along the axis that correspond each segment to one topic. And within that each segment, we have a representation for each user in the network. So we have, we have one node along there for each sender. And then along the other axis, we organize that by time. And again, different segments corresponding to different years, could be different months, different days, and in fact, we allow zooming along that kind of semantic dimension. And so one link in this representation actually captures immediately all four dimensions that we're interested in. So we have a sender sending a message to a recipient on a particular topic at a particular time. So one link representing four dimensions all at once. And in the Hive plot kind of paradigm, you can do what's called cloning. And so actually we can restrict our representation to just 3 dimensions at a time. So one of these links here captures a message from a sender to a recipient on a given topic, ignoring time. And similarly, we can do the same thing with the other dimension. With the other axis. So this is what CommViz looks like in the end. This is a representation of part of the Enron data set. And so actually it's this one screenshot is capturing over 7,000 emails. 7,000 links representing 19,000 emails between 90 different people from that data set, organized into 20 topics, and one link again capturing all 4 dimensions. Now, because we are restricting to particular time frames, we have multiple messages on the same topic between the same 2 individuals, and so we count how many times that happens, and we use the coloring and the shading here to indicate the sort of strength or the amount of emails that are going back and forth between those people. So yep, we're working with the Enron data set. Basically, we applied natural language processing to try to come up with the topics, and we mapped it into a back-end relational database, which we then visualize using D3. We process the emails. I won't go into a lot of details. The topic modeling is just a standard methodology called latent Dirichlet allocation, which is a probabilistic graphical framework for trying to infer basically connections between text and topics. Again, I won't go into the detail. So we took we took the Enron data set, and this is an example of one of the topics. So here we're talking power, gas, market, price, plants. It's a collection of words that represents a theme that's emerged from the data set. We implemented this as a RESTful web service, again using Flask, and then, as I said, used the D3 library. So the basic representation of each node is very simple. We just have an identifier for the node. We have some metadata about the individual. And then the edges, of course, just connect 2 nodes to each other. And those nodes have been assigned to a particular axis and a particular segment on the axis, which corresponds to a topic. And so what we're trying to see is whether we can use this representation then to answer some of those visual queries. How many messages were sent between 2 people on a given topic? What topic is associated with the largest number of messages? And during which time periods was a topic most prevalent? And so we were considering link density and link color to try to help us answer these questions. Yep, I guess I already talked about that. So in the visualization, you can actually select one particular link. It's hard because it's so dense. So when you have a lot of links on one screen, this can be a bit difficult. But if you do manage to select one of the links, then you can see the metadata that's associated with it in the visualization. When you zoom in, this becomes easier because the links spread out. So you can drill down to particular time frames that you're interested in and get in a bit deeper there. So this is an example of the zooming where we split the year 2000 into the months, and you can keep going down by day as well. Yeah, don't know what I wanted to say there. Oh, I guess I wanted to show how you can see what the topic consists of just by hovering over it. So these are all aspects of the visualization. So we heard from Ben, I think, earlier about parallel coordinates. You can take this exact same paradigm and apply it in a parallel kind of representation. And in fact, this has an advantage over the standard parallel coordinates because now, again, we can capture 4 dimensions in one link rather than having to do the sort of connection across the coordinates that we saw with the representation of the standard parallel coordinates. And so really, now I call this semantic parallel coordinates. And the trick is just to combine multiple dimensions into one axis, right? Yes, so we did actually a user study to validate that this is actually accomplishing what we hope it does. And so we ran on Mechanical Turk, a study where we asked users to answer questions about the same representation of the data, one using CommViz and one using the standard node link graph. This is actually implemented in Cytoscape. And we just asked simple questions like, what was the most popular topic discussed? It's actually completely obvious in this representation, and I have no idea in the standard representation. And so, yeah, we had 6 questions, we had a bunch of Mechanical Turkers, and overall, we had statistically significant differences in the ability of the Turkers to answer the questions we asked them based on our representation. So from a research perspective, we were satisfied that actually our intuition about the ease with which we could interpret the data was supported. There's still a bunch of things that we need to work on. I'm not completely happy with the responsiveness of the tool as it's implemented, and a bunch of other details that I won't go into. But basically, I hope I've convinced you that we can take these 4 dimensions of this very complex communication data and put it into a meaningful 2-dimensional representation to capture both the social network relationships that are clearly important in these data sets, but also those thematic and temporal characteristics in order essentially to support visual analytics. And I'll stop there and just acknowledge that, we had funding and inspiration from DST Group for this work, and I had some collaborators, Bahadur Fogi, who was postdoc in my group at the time, and Marlene, who was an amazing Master of IT student who did all the D3 implementation. And then 2 additional students whose names are unfortunately cut off who helped us with the user study. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Karin. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. If anybody has. Yes.
So to get your 2 dimensions on one axis, that requires you to have, does that require you to have categorical data to do the grouping?
Well, so we have categorical data, right? So the grouping there assumes that we're able to analyze the messages into those topics. You could use other information. So actually we have adaptations of the exact same kind of representation to very different kind of data sets. There was a visualization challenge a couple of years ago that looked at communications within an amusement park. And in that case, we didn't use topics because we didn't have access to the actual messages. We just had a sender of a message, a recipient of a message, a location within the amusement park from which the message was sent, and the timestamp. And so we used, in that case, the location information to help organize. But yeah, you have to have some way or some dimension of interest. You can think of it as context broadly that you want to use to organize the data. But yeah, you have to have something to organize the data.
I'm just wondering, based on your experience, comparing Hive plot to parallel coordinates, which one is easier to analyze?
So, I mean, the standard parallel coordinates has the problem that if you have this kind of 4-dimensional data, you can't actually ever look at 4 dimensions at once in any kind of aggregate sense. Every coordinate represents 1 dimension of the data, so most So every link is pairwise, right? It's just two dimensions connecting. And it's quite tricky to look for patterns that involve multiple dimensions simultaneously. And so actually, it wasn't until a reviewer of the paper that we published about this work said, oh, you really need to compare with parallel coordinates. And we actually took Enron and stuck it into the standard parallel coordinates. I was like, this doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't help us with this problem. And once we worked out that actually, oh, we can use that same trick of organizing along the axes in the parallel sense, then I realized, okay, well, you can either do it this way, vertically, or sorry, with parallel coordinates, or you can do it in the radial. I think the radial has advantages if you can organize the information quantitatively. So the next thing that's still an open research question is whether we can, for instance, use things like the frequency of a topic to help us organize things along that dimension, along the axis, so that we can couple the benefits of the quantitative network analysis with this kind of semantic analysis. And in that case, we'll have advantages because basically things are further apart at the outer ends of the axes and much closer together at the inner portion, which gives you some advantages if what you're really interested in is a quantitative aspect. So yeah, we're looking at that next.